Well, now we say welcome to Billy Kay. Hello to you, Billy.
Hi.
Now, you're known best for, I would suggest, things like, well, broadcasting, obviously, and writing, etc., and a lot about Scottish history, culture and language. Does that tie into politics for you as a Scot?
It does, in that without the cultural argument, there's no argument as far as I'm concerned. I remember being invited to speak at an SNP fringe meeting with Stephen Maxwell. It must have been about 30 years ago. And I was there to talk about the culture. And I was astonished that there was this room full of young men in suits who wanted Scottish independence purely for economic and reasons of creating a better society, whereas my whole basis in it was coming from a working class, Scots-speaking, Burns-loving, Burns-singing family, and that to me was one of the important things of my identity.
Would that be classed nowadays as ethnic nationalism? Because you always get this big debate, and there is actually, it's quite funny, I think anyway, that there is almost a fear of the word nationalist now in our Western culture, because of identification with, I don't know, it could be anything, the Balkans to Nazi Germany to Irish Republican nationalist, etc. I mean, what's your take on all of that?
Well, I agree with you, and how words change their meaning. And the word nationalism, I'm afraid, changed its meaning after the 1940s. The word fascism changed its meaning dramatically after the 1940s. When I did my Odyssey book and series in the early 1980s, I had photographs of Scots Italians in places like the meadows under Stirling Castle having a fascist picnic. In the 1930s, it was part of their national identity at that time. Fascism didn't have the connotations of what it later had because of the Jewish situation.
Well, the British fascists.
That's right. So it was part of their culture from their homeland to celebrate this national movement. Now, the image of fascism, the image of nationalism changed after the 1940s. But I would maintain that basically, in modern Scottish history, not a crown has been broken in the name of Scottish nationalism. It has been the most pacifist douce movement, full of intellectuals and poets and writers. That the idea of it being tied in with blood and soil nationalism is just outrageous.
And yet there is a kind of a mainstream media cartoon of Scotland, Scottish nationalism, which is Braveheart, which is the blue face, etc., isn't it? I mean, that continues.
It's there, but anyone who knows Scottish culture, I mean, again, the idea of coming from the Burns background with songs like A Man's a Man for All That, to link that in with right-wing fascism is just so ludicrous that it's not worth talking about. But some of the reactions are along those lines. They just can't help themselves. That is the Pavlov's dog's slavering reaction to the word Scottish nationalism for a lot of people, unfortunately. No matter how civic it has proved itself to be over the past 20 years.
So what is it for you then? Is it almost like a natural impulse that as a Scot you think we should be independent? I mean, is it as simple as that?
It's almost as simple as that. I, from a very early age, just responded to being Scottish and the Scottishness of my culture.
Sorry to cut you a little bit, did it matter to you then that the country was not an independent sovereign state in its own right? I mean, because there's also this other aspect to our debate now, which is that you can be, they say, the patriotic Scot, but within the Union. Does that make sense to you?
No, it makes no sense whatsoever, because I've seen how Scottish culture has been marginalised within that Union. They were only allowed to go so far. I mean, in the world of broadcasting, for example, in an ideal world, my programmes would be going out on British broadcasting, and they did. My Odyssey series in the early 1980s went out. I think there were 3 series on Radio 4. Dundee Jute Spinners, St Kildan's, talking about climbing the cliffs, men at the Gallipoli and the Dardanelles, working class Scottish voices being broadcast on the British media. The British media has narrowed and narrowed down to a very Anglo-centric, home county-centric world picture, so that everything that doesn't belong to that world picture has been excluded. So I've seen in my own lifetime Britishness becoming narrower and narrower and excluding Scottishness. And at the same time, I've seen examples of the marginalisation of Scottish culture. I mean, I did a series called The Cause, A History of Scottish Nationalism, and there was a section in it giving examples of what I call the inferiorisation of Scottish culture, and that could have been a whole programme. Just examples of people looking down on the culture and presuming that was a natural thing to do, to look down on the culture. And it extended not just to ethnic Scottish culture, but anything Scottish. So that I had voices like Professor Cairns Craig of Aberdeen University, or Alexander Brodie of Glasgow University, two of the men who promoted the Scottish Enlightenment, telling me that at Edinburgh University, when they studied philosophy, David Hume was hardly taught. Adam Smith was hardly taught. The common sense philosophical school that had been there for a century and a half and affected philosophical discourse around the world had ceased to be taught because it was Scottish. In other words, the cringe reached such a stage, I would say, in the 60s and 70s, that provoked the rise of cultural nationalism, but it had reached a terrible stage by that time.
Well, just to delve further into that, does that mean, though, that in a way some of this idea for independence is a reaction to what you're describing? I mean, if, for example, Britain and the British state that we know today had worked harder, had it been more open and welcoming and accepting and accepted all of those different regional differences national differences that we have, and I don't know, politically maybe become a federal state or something, and represented all the different parts of the UK rather than being so London-centric, as I would put it, might we not be in the position that we are in now, of just about to vote on an independence referendum?
It's quite possible. It is quite possible. But I think because of the imbalance of the numbers game, of the number of English people and the dominance of England in the British Isles, I think it would be very hard to have that kind of union of equals.
But I mean, what I'm saying is that there is people who want independence partly because they're reacting against the way that that Britain has been changed, as you've just described, rather than saying, from a pure point of view, I want independence because that's just a natural thing. In a way, Britain has brought this on itself.
That's very important, but anyone who's brought up, I mean, in my household, there was no political nationalism because they'd come from that mining background of strong socialist tradition and international socialism. But culturally, my father and my whole family were cultural nationalists. And it's natural that when their culture was denigrated, that they would react and demand recognition for that culture. So it's a mixture of cultural nationalism and also the fact that so much that the British state had a good reputation for, like the National Health Service. It's almost as if that stage of Britishness has come to an end, and it's the success of the Scottish Parliament in holding on to, ironically, some aspects of Britishness, that the Scottish state, with its more egalitarian traditions, has a better chance of continuing.
Should there be, in this referendum campaign, more expression of that kind of, if you like, Scottish culture? I mean, an awful lot of it is predicated on, we want to transform our society. Grand, yes we do, and we all got different versions of what that is, but it's almost as if independence is a means to that end, but not an end in itself. I mean, would you like to hear more Scottish passion in the campaign? I would like to see more passion, because £500 here or there, who cares? It's like changing your energy supplier. If that was what it was about, who cares? No, it's about passion, and it's about the heart, and it's about the fact that there is ingrained in Scottish culture an egalitarianism which hasn't existed in a lot of different places. Ian McWhirter mentioned it in a piece in the Herald recently and said, these could be constructed as myths, but what a great myth to have of egalitarianism, that I'm no better than anybody else, but I'm no any worse than anybody else. A man's a man for all that. Here stay as was. I think
And the fact that, I mean, I did a lot of my Odyssey programs in the early 1980s were about ethnic groups coming into Scotland, programs on the Glasgow Irish, on the Lanarkshire Lithuanians, on the Glasgow Jewish community. And within a generation, they'd all bought into Scottish culture because of that egalitarian tradition that they immediately felt they could belong to. And I think it's fantastic that, for example, the modern Polish migration, which mirrors the Scottish migration to Poland in the 17th century. A lot of these returning Poles are returning Scots with Scottish blood in them, that they immediately realise the parallels and again buy in to Scottish identity and realise that they can be Polish Scots or Pakistani Scots or Scots-speaking Scots or Gaelic Scots or etc., that it's not an exclusive, it's one of the most inclusive identities in the world, I think.
Well, I was going to say, do you think that happens the same way in other countries of which you have experience?
No.
The same idea that, if you emigrate there, you become, I don't know, a Portuguese Scot or something. Does it happen in the same way?
Not to the same extent, no. And there's a greater fear, I think, of immigration. And England's a classic example. There's a greater fear of immigration in a lot of European nations than there are in Scotland. And, for example, David Deiches, in his book, Two Worlds in Edinburgh Jewish Childhood, says that his father, who was the chief rabbi in Scotland, prided himself on being a Jewish Scot and the fact that Scotland was one of the few nations in Europe where there had not been discrimination against Jewish people. So I think, as a badge of identity, what a great pride we can take in that people right through to the Polish Votes Yes group today form an identity and an affection for the culture, and that diversity can only be a good thing.
There is, of course, a part of the unionist campaign in this referendum is to talk that stuff down, not try and deny the reality, but they do say things like, look, you're not really any different from the generally British opinion and English approaches to things like immigration and benefits, ripping off the benefit system, etc. But I always think the answer to that is, well, people may tell the opinion posters that, but look at what the Scottish Parliament actually legislates to do, things like universal benefits and, we get free care for the elderly, etc. And no tuition fees at university. I mean, these are dramatically different things from what's happened in English political culture.
That's right.
Yeah, so do you think that is yet another expression of that difference?
Yes, it's an expression of Scottish culture. All of these things are examples of the ethos that has been at the forefront of Scottish thought for several centuries. I gave us a talk at Dundee University as part of their 5 million questions, which is on YouTube, and you can go and see it. And I quote the fact that when boroughs like Dundee were formed, when the Scottish kings back in the 12th century, 11th century were creating these boroughs, the king addressed his proclamations to Scotis et Anglis, Frankis et Flemingis, to the Scots, English, French and Flemish inhabiting these new towns, the new boroughs of Scotland. So from its inception, Scotland's been a multilingual, multicultural society that Willie McIlvanney in one of his novels describes as a proudly mongrel society, and I think that's a great concept to have.
And despite all of the, well, I don't say it's a contradiction, but some people might suggest that someone who's so proudly Scottish, you've got a very internationalist, not just an outlook, but your life. You're a linguist. How many languages do you?
I can speak French, German. I've got some Russian. I've got Russian higher. I can speak Portuguese. And I've got some Gaelic. But because I speak Portuguese, for example, I can understand Catalan, I can understand Spanish, because once you've got this linguistic range, there are very few places in Europe that you can go. Where I was speaking to a Polish person the other day, and she was talking to her wee girl, and I heard her say the word dziewuszka. I says, that's the word for a girl, isn't it? And she said, yeah. She says, because I know that from Russian, because I did higher Russian at Kilmarnock Academy. And my kids have the great fortune that when Scotland isn't playing well, they support Portugal and Cristiano Ronaldo. She's Portuguese, so they've got dual heritage, if you like, and it's it's great because they're now fluent in several languages too and working. My son's in Moscow promoting the next World Cup in Russian football. He's just back from Rio de Janeiro where he spoke Portuguese and Russian and was the only person who could do so just about. So having that rich linguistic background, because my children were every day in life heard Scots spoken from me and my wife, Portuguese spoken, then it just takes off and becomes easy to learn other languages.
Yeah. And I mean, you did, well, certainly one of the series I'm always interested in is the one about wine, which is one of my own things. But I mean, you know, you told us, I didn't realise that Scotland had this long association with Bordeaux, with the Red Biddy.
Well, there's, I mean, fantastic quotes about claret, that it was the national drink of Scotland. Gid claret best keeps out the cold and drives awa the winter soon. It makes a man baith gash and bold and heaves his soul beyond the moon. Let ne's day come as it thinks fit, the present minute's only ours. On pleasure, let's employ our wit and laugh at fortune's feckless poors. Hundreds of great quotes about claret like that, going back to the heyday of the Old Alliance.
Yeah, what I like about that though is it kind of dispels the idea of the small nation, the small country, the insular, the parochial. You know, one of the arguments is if you do become independent, you know, I mean, some people say, well, I'm going to emigrate, because I think the Scot who's director of the Royal Shakespeare Company said, you'll stop doing Shakespeare in Scotland. And one of our opera singers said, I'm going to emigrate to Canada, she'll stop doing opera. And yet the opposite has always been true about Scotland.
Always been the case. And I've done several series, Merchants, Peddlers, Mercenaries, about the Scots in the Baltic, the oldest alliance about the Scots in France. My book, The Scottish World, is all about that. And what you find is that because of that great Scottish tradition that goes back to the Reformation and the idea of having a school in every parish, the fact that the Scottish migration to the Baltic, for example, was a literate migration, they were able to keep their records. So I'm interviewing people in Sweden, in Norway, in Poland, the Tylers in Poland, who left Aberdeenshire in 1620, but who've kept their records and know every member of the family through to the present day. Colonel John Crawford in Sweden, again, joined Gustav Adolf's army in the 17th century, but is proudly Scottish and Swedish, like 24 other families were ennobled by Gustav Adolf in Sweden. So names like Spence and Douglas are all Scottish and Swedish nobility. So it's a phenomenal influence around the world.
Well, didn't you have the first public lending library in the world, I think, was opened in Scotland? That was
Alan Ramsay. That was Alan Ramsay. I'm currently working on a series on the history of Scottish literature, and that was an important thing, and that was one of the reasons why Scottish literature became so important to Scots in their identity through Burns, Ramsay, Ferguson, etc., was the fact that they were literate. And Alan Ramsay started this tradition of libraries, which again went round the world. And Andrew Carnegie is the great exemplar of it. He saw the benefit of that and then gave money for Carnegie libraries to go around the world. So if you go to the States and Canada and various places, you'll find Carnegie libraries. And I think he also insisted there'd be a statue of Burns in every one of them, a bust. So again, proselytising for Scottish literature and culture around the world.
Just lastly, Billy, what would a yes vote mean for you?
Joy. Total joy. I mean, I've been working in the field of Scottish culture as an instinctive cultural nationalist as I was a teenager, but as somebody who's loved exploring my history and culture and exposing people to it who weren't often educated in it. And that's an important thing, of exposing them to the joys and the glories of that culture. That for that to culminate in what I think is the natural state for Scotland in an independent nation would be just a wonderful, wonderful day for me. And I've got an amazing bottle of claret set aside to celebrate it.
Well, I'd like to share that. Billy, thanks very much.
Cheers.